only directed in one area and going one way. I think when you allow teaching to flourish and grow the mind, to grow the creativity of a child's mind, then you can start to measure, because it will reveal itself. Testing's all right, but over-testing does not work. It only works in a business model. I don't know of anyone in here, and I'm a parent with 3 children, who think your child is a business model. Exactly, that's what I thought. This is why it's so important to make sure that in education, that we make sure we always consider the very most important factor in any educational system, and that is the human element. That's the most important thing. And growing the communication between and trust between the educator and the child, or the person being educated. That is so important.
Mm-hmm. I think there's something very simple to this process, right? Let's expose testing for what it is, a money-making scheme.
Absolutely.
Very clear about that. But if we talk about a different way to assess success in schools, something that's often missed is attendance rates.
Yep.
Right? If a young person wants to be in that space, something is happening. Right? Because a dropout factory, quote unquote, ain't gonna have a big attendance rate, right? Nobody wants to be there, right? So this is what school coaching creates, right? Like, I was just having this conversation with my father about 4 or 5 months ago. I said, look, if I'm in a 7th, 8th grade split, we 42 students deep, I ain't going to that. I'm at the house playing Wii. Real talk. We're gonna figure out, me and the homies are going to figure out how some crazy 7th or 8th grade way to go to school at least as humanly possible, to go right up to them 22 days before I get demoted. Right? Because y'all folks know what they're doing. Right? It may be harebrained, it may not work, but we're going to try it, because it's better than being dehumanized 42 deep sitting on the floor in a schoolhouse. Right? So if I think about that in a different way, right? So if we think about how we assess success, and actually there's a lot of data, the Annenberg Institute actually talked about these successful schools, and Troy just broke this thing down. Successful schools, and this is always the weird, bizarro world that we live in the United States, right? Schools that actually have this high-performing testing data do very little with test prep or anything around preparing students or teaching towards the test. We know that across the board, right? So this thing around looking at this test, and again, it's all about this back into who needs to obey and under what terms do they need to obey, right? I mean, why is the ACT asking me a question about a regatta and a Ferrari? That's a real question, those real questions, right? They're asking young folks about Ferraris and regattas, right? What does that have to do with anything, right? And at the same time, this is the determinant of life opportunities. And colleges even have said, look, it's too much weight on these tests, right? Let's look at a comprehensive application that actually takes more time and more work to assess. But like fellow panelist was saying, this business model wants you to get a cookie cutter relationship with each space. And everybody that doesn't fit to that cookie cutter model, we see where they go. No, it's not just low-wage service sector work, it's jail. Right? And the data for the Department of Juvenile Justice here in the state of Illinois shows us that. Look at the 9 zip codes that have the highest instances of arrest rates. Right? And just so let's not be dismissive of what this thing really is. So when we call it out, we have those strategies by which to pose something different.
It does what we do with testing. You can't come out with a Common Core standard that says we want our students to be critical thinkers and then attempt to measure it with a multiple choice test. One of the aspects of high-performing systems is that they're coherent. That it looks like the system was actually designed by someone with some intention. That one thing naturally evolves from the other. You can't have critical thinking. No high-performing system does that. They have high standards for critical thinking, and they have made the decision that we don't think any machine can measure what we're looking for, so we're going to have human beings do that. There'll be essay questions where people have to apply the strategies they've been taught to novel problems. And they don't test everyone. They pick like maybe 3rd grade, 8th grade, 12th grade, and even then they only pick a sample of students from each one of those grades just so they can sort of dipstick and see, are we on the right path? They don't use their results to punish teachers, to evaluate people, and I wish I had time to get into the nonsense of that and how it takes away from your children's education. But if you want to look at how we can sort of see if it's working, you know, when I said it should be, the system has a responsibility to prepare people who are prepared to enter into the political system and advocate for themselves. So look, are people prepared to do that? Are the people who need the most advocacy out there advocating for themselves? And when they are, what's the quality of it? Can they articulate themselves? Can they articulate them? You know, I see people advocating for public education, and I'm not down on them at all. Get out there, get in the street. But many of us can't even sort of articulate the purpose of public education and its centrality to the democratic process. You know, even me. You know, I'm reading a book called The Origin of the Civil Rights Movement by Mr. Alvin Morris. And he really gets into how those folks, I mean, he goes into communities and churches, and he talked to every major and minor player who was there. In the 1970s, he wrote this book. He also happens to be my next door neighbor. And so I go out and I mow my lawn, and my wife is up there. I go out and I mow my lawn, and you can tell sometimes the lawnmower stops. Because I get over to that fence, and Mr. Morris told me, he's writing a book on W.B. Du Bois, and he said it's going to shock the sociological world, right? And I go over to that fence, I turn the mower off, hoping that I can get his ear and we can get into a dialogue. So like, how did these people with no cell phones, no email, organize themselves like that? I'm reading this chapter, and so right now I am at almost 44 years old getting the education on political savvy that I should have gotten when I was 12. Right? So the system is failing.
The best way to measure whether or not education works is when the student mentally can recognize and apply it to everyday common sense life. That's when you know it works. When the student begins to recognize how things operate and maintain themselves around them. You know, as a father, education begins at birth with a child. So things that I've taught my son, things I've showed him how to do in tying his shoes, the importance of making sure your shoes are tied so you don't trip over them, you don't injure yourself, you have more support for your feet when you run and jump. And educating him on that, I've watched him as he's grown to make sure that that's one of the things he makes sure he does before he begins to walk out that door. So I think what we have to do is make sure that also applies in the system. That what the teacher is giving in the classroom, the student is able to take that back home and mimic it and apply it to everyday life around what they found out. In other words, when mom says, go to the store and purchase this, because of the mathematics they've learned in school and the way the teacher has taught them, we can tell if that system works because when they go to the store, they know exactly how much change they're supposed to get back. I try to apply what works and doesn't work to what's reasonable and what's common in everyday life. And I think that's one way of measuring if something works or not.
So these themes together. When I was in the Oakland public schools and with the Rodney King incited riots at that point in time, there was a teachable moment about applying the lessons from Dr. Martin Luther King to the situation and the context. We have a similar notion here. It's not simply about memorizing names and dates, but it's to say, if Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. were alive today, what would he be doing in response to Ferguson? What would that look like for your students to take their understanding of his principles, his means, his actions, and develop a response to that situation is how some of these connect together. You've been very patient, Elizabeth.
No, actually, you said a lot of what I wanted to say, which is the testing. Testing should only be sporadic to test the system, not to,
Punish
test
teachers.
to death, evaluate the students. So, I mean, I have had students crying because they are the top performers and they are presenting questions that are 4 grades above their level.
You know, right now, you know, circulating around among my colleagues is the personal pledge for ethical use of student data. Mm-hmm. And the first line is, I'm a child-driven teacher, not a data-driven teacher.
There you go.
And in the testing culture that we've developed over the last, 10 years, maybe longer, you know, but the students understand now. I teach 7th grade science. They understand now that if they don't do so well the first time they take a test, that they're going to look really, really great on paper when they take it for the final test and their score is, you know, top of the charts. They understand how to game the system. We've over-tested them to the point that they don't even know any different. You know, they're not even surprised anymore when I say, oh, you know what, we're going to do the end of year map. You know, oh, okay, we're going to do that. And it's to the point that, I mean, they accept it, but I feel like it's a point of abuse.